We know at the beginning that we're ready. Otherwise, we weren't ready. It couldn't be the beginning. It would have to be already something wrong. No, it's actually nice being here to come and talk after Ellie has shown her stuff, because it puts me into a very good mood. She's irrepressibly comic, which is something I've always loved about her. In fact, one of the things I used to say, and I don't dare say it without Ellie around, is the reason I was so happy to marry her is she always makes me laugh. Don't think that's a trivial thing. It's not trivial to be able to laugh. Considering the world we happen to be in at the moment, that doesn't have the laughter seems to be one of the few ways of surviving. It's not that I want to go into the long list of things that are going on in the world that I don't like, but the situations all over the world, it always seems to be in a point of crisis. And if you constantly pay attention to the crisis, you get totally depressed. It doesn't help anybody that you do that either. So even if the ship is sinking, you may as well be amused while the ship sinks. At least you might like the tunes they play while the Titanic goes under the water. I originally intended, when I came here to do this, last year I was going to come here, and the Iceland volcano interfered with my life and prevented me from coming. And it's interesting to be prevented by a volcano. It seems like overkill, doesn't it? Just one poet coming to participate in a conference and the volcano says you can't come. But we have things like that all the time, apparently. I should imagine that the volcanoes, if you didn't have a volcano, I guess it would be turned out you might have a tsunami, or you might have an earthquake, or you might just have a rainstorm, or you might have an absence of rain. All of these wonderful contingencies that the world is made up of. And then we come and theorize ways around it in which we make ourselves feel as if we understood what had happened. In some sense or another, the earthquake and the tsunami that have placed Japan in great peril seem so startling. They seem startling in a certain sense that when it would have expected the Japanese, who had suffered the direct effects of an atomic bomb, you'd have imagined they had a phobia. You'd imagine they had a phobia to the nuclear energy. And apparently they didn't have a phobia to nuclear energy. They should have had. And we learned that they let terrible things happen in their inspections and their safeguards against bad situations. But even in the best of all possible worlds, probably they wouldn't have anticipated an earthquake and a tsunami hitting just where their major nuclear reactor complex is. You wouldn't expect it, but maybe you have to expect bad things as being, even if they're improbable. The improbable happens. There's a difference between the improbable and the impossible. The improbable is never impossible. The impossible is hard to tell. How do you know something's impossible? It never happened. Well, it never happened, but then it happens. Then it wasn't impossible. It reminds me a little bit of the limitations of Wittgenstein's early work, the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, in which he says in his opening sentence, the very shocking opening sentence, Die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist, that the world is everything that is the case. And that seemed to leave out a lot. If you would think about the tsunami the tsunami and the horrible effects of the tsunami, you say to yourself, well, it wasn't the fact that this could happen. For a long time, it wasn't the fact. It was like a black swan or a white raven. Actually, I prefer thinking of it as a white raven. If the tsunami couldn't, with any probability, have happened, unfortunately, it happened. And so what wasn't the fact before that a tsunami could destroy your nuclear plant, it might not have been a fact at the beginning. It might have been a fact that this wasn't the case. So it's a fact that a tsunami will not destroy your power plant because we have all these safeguards. And then it destroys the power plant, and it becomes a fact that it did do it. So what does Wittgenstein in the age of his early work suppose happens? How can it be that the world is everything that is the case if the world turns out to have new things that are the case and there are things that have become no longer the case? The problem is things are constantly changing from being the case to not being the case, to maybe being the case. And while I thought about this to some extent, I had wanted, before I had been interrupted by this goddamn volcano with an unpronounceable name, at least unpronounceable to non-Icelanders, but I had originally intended to come up here and do a talk relating to the idea of experience, which has been one of my major interests, is why I'm so committed to the notion of experience and what there is in the notion of experience distinguishes it, let's say, from a theoretical report. The first thing about the term experience that is interesting to me is that you can't define experience collectively. In other words, experience is it refers to a collection of scenes. Experience may be something like a petroleum. You say petroleum, you don't mean a petroleum, do you? Is a petroleum, is there such a thing as a petroleum? No. Is there such a thing as grain? Yes. Is there such a thing as experience? What do you mean when you say experience? What does the damn word mean? Does it mean an experience? John Dewey had a book that he wrote, a very strange book he wrote, very inadequate in certain ways, but it has very brilliant aspects to it. And it's a book called Art as Experience. But is art as experience mean the same thing as art as an experience? Or does it mean that art is an experience? The word experience floats in this strange place. He really thinks he means art consists essentially of having an experience, generating an experience in some way. And what was an experience to John Dewey was rather curious. He gives an account of a man who, I think it was a man, and maybe it was a woman, who, in those days they never wrote with women as the examples of the things. So let me say, it was a woman who has come to Paris, and she has been told about this wonderful restaurant on the right bank, which has the most astonishingly tasteful boeuf de bourguignon that had ever been tasted by anybody alive. Now that seems for a hearty, commonplace dish like that, it seems it should be no problem. Well, she orders the dish, and before she orders the dish, she also orders an appetizer of frog's legs. Again, the specialty of the house, the little amphibian legs. But the little amphibian legs come to her, and she's waiting for all this. In the meantime, she's ordered an extremely beautiful white wine, from one of the great maisons around. And she has this white wine served to her as well, and she starts to eat the frog's leg, and it tastes to her like dried out chicken legs. And she's really feeling very bad about this. But she then waits for her boeuf bourguignon, and the boeuf bourguignon comes in, it's tough and stringy. And she then she thought she would carry it off maybe with a glass of good Bordeaux. And she had ordered the Bordeaux, and it didn't taste as great as it should have. Now she's in the midst of a total disaster, and they ask her if she wants a dessert, which seems like a crowning insult after having offended her with the entree and the main dish. And now they're offering her consolation. They're saying, how about a dessert? But she thinks she'll try. And she orders an apple and a slab of brie. And the apple comes in, and it is the most beautiful apple you've ever seen. It has this sort of aroma, the odor of the apple is like a romantic effusion. And the wine that she ordered for that turns out to be much better. But the cheese is the masterpiece. This is a Normandy brie that you have never seen anything like. And she remembers the taste of this. Years later, she's very ill and she's dying. And her son, who is surviving her, says to her, "Mother, you must have had experiences that made your life worth living." She said, "No, but I had one." And he said, "What was that? What was that, Mother?" She said, "Of the apple and the brie. I remember the apple, and I remember the brie, and I remember the debris of the rest of the meal through which I climbed in order to arrive at this final dessert, the memory of which allows me to die in peace." And then she dies. Now, this is an account of an experience. It's mobilized. It's mobilized around it. Desire. In fact, it has what I call narrative substance. Now, for John Dewey, apparently his theory is that experience essentially is narrative. That is to say, you remember a thing by the subjective involvement you have in it, in which you desire something, and there are elements that either come to your aid literally in accomplishing it, or defeat your possibilities one way or the other. And so you have a kind of struggle with something in order to have an actual experience, and the actual experience has got a narrative form. And discontent with his account of it, which was a little bit my hyperbolic account of John Dewey's account of an experience, he is not happy with that. He's not satisfied with that as his idea of how to represent what an experience is. So he says, imagine a rock, a little rock at the top of a hill. Imagine it as having a point of view. What would its point of view be? The point of view essentially is to achieve a resting place that is the most pleasant resting place it could possibly find, so that it could stay there forever. The immortalization of the rock in the pleasure of its position in the world. But then comes the rainstorm, and the rain floods the area, and the rivulets pick up the little rock and dislodge it from its space, and it starts to roll down the hill. And then it encounters on the way a variety of obstacles, but it seems to be intent on coming to rest at some place, and the only place it could come to rest would be at the bottom of the hill. So the rock keeps trying to come down the right way, but there are other rocks in its way, obstacle rocks. They kick it in the shins. They try to hold on to it, they interfere with it, it dodges them. It's a very clever little rock. It pirouettes and it moves away like a ballerina dancing. I guess I'm being influenced by other ones. It leaps. It creates a grand jeté over which it leaps in order to get closer. It pirouettes. It comes down. It does it. Then it also does little bourrée-like steps. And this little rock finally comes to a resting place at the bottom of the hill, and feels it has achieved final victory. Now, this kind of theory of narrative theory of experience seems to me a little bit too funny. But the thing about Dewey is he's trying to make it a concrete psychological genre, the genre of experience. Now, when you think of it that way, the question is that what we mean when we say experience? Or do we merely mean that something that we have actually participated in consists of a series of experience? In other words, it may have the narrative form that it does, but the issue of the word experience is that it refers to something that's not theory, that's not content, pure concept. It's some kind of understanding, it seems to represent, for most people who use it, some kind of apprehension of reality that is greater in its significance than an abstract account of it. So that, in effect, a first-hand experience, which is sometimes the word used for it, what is first-hand? What is a first-hand experience? Is an experience that you have directly, and it sometimes seems to suggest that it's never been had by anybody else before, because this is not generically formed. In other words, it's an experience because it has never been formed before. This seems a little excessive in the idea of experience, but I've often asked myself, what do I mean when I say experience? Because I use the word often when talking about inadequate critical writing. The critical writing seems to come from people who have had very little experience of the things they're talking about. Well, there's a great deal of such talk that literally seems as if, particularly in the arts, which usually it sounds as if these people have never really known how an artwork ever got made. One of the things is that people are very quick to tell you what an artwork means. I once taught a whole class to find out how artworks go about meaning something. And we weren't sure by the end whether we really had a clear idea of it. But the point is, there are people perfectly willing to tell you what an artwork means, though they may never tell you how it gets to mean it, or how it lets you know that that's what I mean. I mean, it's as if an artwork gets interrogated and you say to the artwork, "What do you mean?" And the artwork tries to tell you the answer. "I mean this." That doesn't count. That doesn't sort of square with my experience, to use the word. I mean, you start to do something, you're attracted to some possibility. I was attracted to the possibility of a poetry of thinking. That is the notion of the human mind taking its shape, or shaping things, trying to shape things, as it were, to sort of throw light upon them in certain ways, to evoke certain possibilities. Like, if you have an artwork like, let's say, Eleanor's imaginary ballerinas. We know they're imaginary ballerinas. She's trying to decide what herself is, and decides herself is a series of genres. One genre is a ballerina, another genre is another genre is a king, another genre is a nurse. And you look at these things and say, well, she's decided she consists of 3 genres, or 3.5. At one point you have a black ballerina. Well, that's, just it's not a full genre yet. It's just an impossible genre at the time it was written, but it's not a full genre. And so you wind up saying to yourself, how did she come to this? She didn't come to it all at once. If she couldn't have come to it all at once. She took one step, and then she took a second step, and then she took another step, the way artists make artworks or poets make poems. You start with something. You may start with some sort of image of something. If she started 100 boots, she sort of imagined she saw 100 boots, facing the sea. Why 100 boots facing? If you're, like a certain kind of critic, you say, well, what the hell does she mean by 100 boots facing the sea? Then they would come up with a theoretical account of what it means, why facing the sea is different from having their back to the sea. 100 boots were not turning away from the sea, they were facing the sea. They were facing the immeasurable and the unmeasured, the chaotic, and no, she had 100 boots facing the sea. She said to me one morning, David, what do you think of 100 boots facing the sea? And I said, I don't know. I've never seen them before. She said, well, that's what I'm going to do. And I figured she would do something intelligent with them. So what she did, she lined them up on the beach and they faced the sea. And there was the fact that she didn't know what they were going to do either, but it occurred to her, once she had 100 boots facing the sea, she wanted more 100 boots pictures, because that didn't seem to exhaust the energy-generating character of the work. A work sometimes, you're on a roll when a work of yours suggests more things to be done. When it is a point of closure, it's a work you got to get out of. And because the closure is a defeat for the artist. So she decided she would have a series of such images. And then she started to have the images. She didn't know what those images would necessarily be. She didn't know that it was going to turn into something like a picaresque little novel. There were 100 boots going to the bank. It's a nice idea to have 100 boots go to the bank. And what do they do? Withdraw feet? I mean, what do you do with 100? What do 100 boots have to do with the bank? Well, it cost money to buy the 100 boots. Were they there to pay back the cost of having been bought? I mean, they were ransomed from the shelves of an Army and Navy store and turned into adventurers and felt liberated. And so they felt they were paying Eleanor back for the $100 that she spent buying. I think it was about $2 a boot or something like that. And so were they going to pay back Eleanor by going to the bank and withdrawing funds for her, so that she could send the news to everybody? Look, 100 boots have been liberated from the shelves. It's a way of thinking about it. It happens in parts. Now, as an artist, I've always had a taste for thinking of things in relation to what might be a plausible example, to see if that would make sense. If it would make sense to consider something like that. And I was being questioned by a very good poet named Don Wellman of a kind of Olson background. He asked me why I had abandoned collage for a reinterpretation of narrative. And the question posed that way defeats an answer. And he's a smart guy, but the point of it is, when you ask the question that way, you can't get an intelligent answer, because the why suggests too much simplicity in it. What I was suggesting was that the development of American media, probably globally, produced a mass media version of collage. That the formation of images on television is essentially creates anti-narrative structures, because what happens is, given the system of financing in which commercials are paid for, the people who go to watch television don't go to pay admission and determine their relationship by paying for admission. The images are subsidized, or the video is subsidized by sponsors who pay money to have their crap more or less being represented on television, right? And these little films that represent, these little films that represent toothpaste or condoms or Cadillacs are wrapped around and into the middle of the otherwise straightforward entertainment forms. So if you have a narrative form, if you have a story type program, whatever kind, it will be cut in 3 places. It will have something immediately coming in ahead of it that will not belong to it, and it will have something in the middle of it that will not belong to it, and you have something at the end that will not belong to it, and then within the things that don't belong to it are things that have the same generic structure as the thing they're cutting into, but with different material. And then you have things in which the station people advertise their own character, their own network, and future programs. So there's a collage of that stuff that shows up before a program begins, and in the middle of it, and at the end of it. And you have this whole set of collage-like structures that are created by television's financing system that produces collage. And the collage, which was a very rich and extremely promising development, because it was a form of reference without representation. It was sort of like, it was representation by associative means. And when you looked at that kind of, in other words, it was essentially produced by what's called the principle of economy. That is, the meaning of a collage was essentially the associated, the connotational aspects of a collage. So in 1912, Picasso, or 1913, Picasso, probably better, Picasso would be a mixture of things that were fragments of things he wanted to refer to and connected, juxtaposed against fragments of drawings that represented the things. And more radically, Schwitters, who was a much more radical collagist than Picasso, is an assemblage of mixtures of garbage, that is, things that have deteriorated and fallen apart, poetically called Merzbau, Merz structures or craft structures. They were put together and celebrated the freewheeling principle, the meaning-making principle of autonomy, which essentially is connotational freedom. And as it felt as connotational freedom, it's one thing. But when it becomes connotationally appropriate, that's when you begin to worry about whether you're working the right way. As soon as I realize something is like the desired form, I begin to get nervous. And I got very, if I had to say to him, what would I have said to Von Roman? I'm getting nervous. It's not the answer he wanted to have from me. He wanted to know what I was getting nervous for. So I decided literally to write a piece, to do a piece. I didn't decide to write it at first. I did it as a performance piece, which is an accident. Because again, contingency enters into this thing the way contingency enters into experience. The KUSC, the Southern California, Los Angeles PBS station, wanted to make a survey of California art, Southern California art, the California artists, and the California poets. And they give everybody an hour, and they send it around. And I said, why do you want me? I'm not a Californian. They said, you've been living here a long time, and furthermore, the people putting this together said they insist on having you. I said, all right, what the hell? But it was in the summer, and I didn't know what to do about it, and I was in the process of doing talk pieces that would be commissioned by people, and they didn't have to be, I could do them anyway, but I had to assemble a group of friendly faculty so I could do a talk performance. And I did. The talk performance addressed the wellness question in terms of a parable. The parable was this. I took my 70-year-old grandmother to go shopping. She insisted she needed to buy shoes. And I would take her to go shopping for shoes. And once we got to this was an experience I was relating. Once I really did this, I took her to Sears Roebuck, because Nola Roebuck was gone. But she remembered Sears, and she wouldn't feel alienated. Whereas if I took her to Nordstrom, she would feel it's an alien country. What kind of world do they have? The department store run by Nordstrom. They sound like Scandinavians. She was used to Jewish merchants and Jewish stores, and so she was hoping for one like that. And she felt happy that I was taking her to Sears, even though it was not a Jewish store. I took her there, and then the question of finding things. In a department store, everything has a kind of theoretical order. It's a theoretical order. That is, you have the lingerie here, you have shoes here, you have this there. Now, there's a theoretical order, but the theoretical order is not based on any inherent underlying logic either. That is to say, why shoes should have abutted perfumes, I have no idea. But in a particular system, there was cosmetics and makeups was on the borderline of the territory called shoes. There's no particular reason for that, but of course it's not terrible for that to be the case, but you have to realize it. And you don't know what to expect in the next system that you come upon. You're totally surprised when it turns out to be lawnmowers. You went from cosmetics to shoes, or you went from shoes to cosmetics, and then you were in lawnmowers. And then you go from lawnmowers to what? You go from lawnmowers to gymnastic equipment. And you go from gymnastic equipment to, what do we go to? Lingerie. And I had to find her shoes. So I thought, well, let's go find her shoes. And we go to this place where they have all the shoes. And she wants something that will be comfortable, really comfortable for hanging around in. And she doesn't like the price, because the last time she bought shoes must have been who knows when. And she doesn't like the way the price, but also she doesn't see the kind of shoes she wants. And I learned there's a bargain, there's also another section somewhere else called bargain shoes, which is not a shoe thing, but it's an anything thing, it's a bargain. So a bargain lawnmower might be right next to a bargain pair of shoes, because it's the bargain section, right? So you have an order that essentially begins to become rather troublesome. You don't know what's coming next. In collage poetry, you delight when you don't know what's coming next. But my mother was not delighted. She was panicked. And telling the story of my mother in Sears became a kind of exercise in finding the difficulty of taking pleasure in something that bewilders you, which is not the most common problem in poetry, but it certainly has that aspect of bewildering, and maybe a useful form of bewildering. In other words, as long as bewildering someone is worth doing, as long as it delays a closure. Collage was worth something when it delayed closure for people who were too used to closure, for people who were struggling against closure. And this made it, but when collage became literally a form of propriety, and it became a thing, that's the thing we do collage. So I wound up basically offering this extraordinarily long story parable as my answer to the question. And it didn't answer the question in the sense that it said, I have done this because I'm tired of being mildly confused or pretending I'm confused. Because what happens is poets soon got very familiar with that, with the habits of collage, and furthermore got to use it so often that it was ultimately a banal approach. But is it always banal? Is there a rule for that? In theory, there may be a rule for it, but my test of it is a test of experience. There are works that are collage works that work anyway. I have not found my work dealing with collage in recent times relevant, but there are things collage can't do, which is kind of interesting. It can't, because it can't really engage with the problematics of the form of experience that we call its narrative form. Collage doesn't work as true narrative. And the reason it doesn't is because it's structured on the breaking up of the true narrative or the breaking up of story. Now here's a crux. I have really made an argument for, and I'm making an argument for it again here, as I make it again and again because I think I'm right, that what we call narrative conventionally essentially is not narrative, but a kind of plot-like thing, which I call story. And let us suppose that a story is a chain of events and parts of events that as it were, that affect a significant transformation. What is an event? An event is some action that moves something from some place to some other place in some way. So what is a narrative? It's not like a sequence of events and parts of events that affect a significant transformation. I argue that narrative essentially is the name I'm giving to the confrontation of a desiring subject with the threat or promise, or threat and promise, of a significant transformation that he, she, or they try to bring about or try to forestall. And it's possible that they're doing both at the same time, trying to bring it on and trying to forestall it at the same time because of its ambiguous outcome. Every transformation is threatening to anybody who faces it, because it turns out that the transformation has turned you from a beggar in the street into a king of a country. Once you're the king of a country, you forget having been a beggar and you wind up having to deal with the king's troubles. And the king's troubles may be revolution and possible execution. I mean, suddenly the ability that it will bring you to destruction, nothing less. So all narrative is the sense of the ambiguous or equivocal sense of the problematics and the effort to deal with it. Now, if that's the case, it seems to operate at right angles to the thing what I call a story. And sometimes you find in a kind of work by most everybody, most stories have narratives in them, or possible narratives in them. And most narratives are found usually wrapped around by story, but they're not always. It's not always. You can have narratives that operate differently as long as they have this. And that's when certain collages actually, or collage-like structures seem to be proto-narrative. For example, when the Franciscan priest, Bernardino da Sahagún, decided literally to map the great culture of the Aztecs, he had Aztec informants and asked them questions. One of his tasks was to ask questions about individual words and interrogate the native speaker about what their experience was of those words. And so you would get things like a mushroom, something called a mushroom. You got the definition of a mushroom. In definition of mushroom read in Aztec, it is round like a severed head. It sounds very Aztec, yes. Or they did a gorge. It is now, or it is narrow. It is narrow. It is dark. It is open. It is open. It is sunny. It is deep. It is shallow. It is horrible. It is sharp. And you get this changing, sequential changes in attitude that seems to project an imaginary narrative in which this person is trying to reenact going through a gorge. In fact, I suspect that what his Aztec informers, who had no idea what a definition was, imagine a Franciscan telling his Aztec translator, tell them I'd like to have their definition of a gorge. What would an Aztec have to do with a definition? They wouldn't have they had no word for a definition. So the native speaker, who is the translator, must have said to them, what's your experience of a gorge? And they gave their experience of the gorge, and the experience came in narrative order. It came, but it didn't come in a story because they thought they just were being told to give their experience. An experience is not story-like necessarily, although it may be. Now, what does this have to do with the question of material? The question is there something more material in the sequences of experience that are given by the Aztecs than an abstract account? You say, this is what this means. Now, I've always thought that, I haven't always thought it, but in very recent years I've thought that what you get out of an experience is more than what you can abstract from it. That an experience has always got something extra, that it has more granularity and more parts, more detail than an abstract account. And I rationalized it this way. Think of it this way. At one point back in the 50s, I was working for the Forestry Department in the United States, and I was there working in northern Idaho, there was the great forest, and we were trying literally to clear the area of a certain kind of disease that vine maple had. These flakes on the vine maple brought bacteria of some kind or other into contact and were poisoning the pine trees. And our job was to literally get rid of as much of this vine maple as we could possibly do. And some of us were better at dealing with the negotiation of the hills. I was one of them. So I was one of the ones mapping the terrain that had to be freed of vine maple. And what I would do is I would have these cords that I would try to find an area of concentrated vine maple and then take little stakes and pin them in and then take cords and wrap them around the configuration in which I found the vine maple. And it was kind of pleasantly lonely work. We were literally drunk on the smell of evergreens, and it was very charming in some respect. It was a virgin forest, and it was a great pleasure. And it was such a great pleasure because even chipmunks were not afraid of you. I mean, if you saw a chipmunk there, because they'd never seen people, if you saw a chipmunk there, you could bend down and look at the chipmunk and look closely, and the chipmunk wouldn't run away if you didn't make a quick move. So it was a very startling area to begin with. And in the midst of this, I'm dragging my little cord along behind me, and it snags on something. I'm in this sort of deliriously pleasant state, and I'm tugging on the cord, and it doesn't go. And I turn around and I think, what is this? And I start to go back, and then I stop, because I see about as far from me as you are over there, standing there, I see a grizzly bear. And the grizzly bear, for the moment, is hunched. A grizzly bear is not like a little black bear. Our camp used to be where we had this camp where the little black bears used to come out and raid the garbage, and we used to drive them away by throwing tennis balls at them, which didn't hurt them, but it panicked them. But the grizzly was not like that. Grizzly was not a little black bear. And what I did is first I froze, and I wanted to see what would happen, because I realized if the grizzly was going to attack me, it would be very difficult to get away anyway, so why don't I just, freeze? And the grizzly sort of stood up, and I would swear it was 10 feet tall. And there I looked at the grizzly, and the grizzly looked, but they have very bad eyesight. I also knew that they don't see very well. I know a lot about these things, more than I know now. And the grizzly bear looked and sniffed the air, and I felt a great sigh of relief, because the air was not blowing from me to him, to her. It was flowing from her to me. So she didn't smell me. And it was summer, when they're well fed and they're not terribly hungry, because there's every kind of fruit and fish available in the virgin forest. And they were not suffering from hunger, and she had not just dropped her cubs. They wouldn't have been in this dangerous position by mid-July. So I thought the best thing I can do is just stand still for a while. And I stood still for a while, and then the grizzly moved off. And all the time the grizzly had been standing on my cord. And I had the cord free again. Now, when I tell the story this way, it's sort of very curious. I was convinced that the grizzly bear had been standing on the cord that I was pulling. Is that really true? I don't know. I remember that because I made a meaningful connection of the grizzly bear's appearance and the snagged cord. It could have been sheer coincidence. The cord could have snagged on a root of something, and the grizzly bear could just have happened to be standing up around that time because it felt like it. And yet somehow the way I told the story is the way I remembered it. And the way I remember it, I can't go back and recover anything that disagrees with it. Once the story is told that way, that's it. So from then on, this story takes on a life of its own. I haven't told. I don't think I may have told Oli this story. I don't think I would. I put it in a piece, but I did tell it to you, so it already had taken shape.
You told it to me recently.
There you go. I was thinking of it for some reason. So once it takes shape, it's been shaped, and this is one of the problems of narrative as opposed to the problem of collage, that a narrative sometimes takes too much shape. And sometimes you have to be very wary of narratives. Like I actually had lived a life very often filled with contingency and images that were contingent. And I had a very charming family, with the sole exception of my mother, who was a total family drag. All the others were lively and bohemian, and my mother was tried to be an American of an ordinary sort, and she wasn't an American, although she didn't have, and she could, or she was an American of an unordinary sort. But the rest of the family were lively anyway, and living with my aunts and my uncles, there was an uncle who became an immediately image of pleasure for me, in that his life was so wonderfully unhappy and peculiar. I was very young when I was living with him. I was about 5, or maybe no, I couldn't have been that old. I must have been nearly not 3 yet. We were sitting on the porch in Brooklyn, and we were crossing the street. There were these team of guys in baseball uniforms, and they were wearing gray uniforms with red socks. And I was sitting with my Uncle Lou on the back porch, and I said to him, "What team are they?" And he said, "The Red Sox." And I started to laugh, because I knew they weren't the Red Sox. They weren't the Boston Red Sox. And he was making a joke. So I was a 2.5-year-old kid who realized that Lou was a very funny guy. And then he would come home under odd circumstances and stay with my grandmother, who lived with three of her daughters. And he would always show up in weird circumstances. Once he showed up with this rather beautiful coffee-colored woman who had a great feather boa, and he told her she was an Indian princess. And I thought that was kind of wonderful too, because I thought somehow princesses were more beautiful if they were Indian princesses, as opposed to little German princesses. I had a taste for the exotic. What could you do? But I enjoyed my uncle. And then on June 16th or June 18th, 1934, a family got a phone call that Lou had fallen off a cliff in Yosemite and was dead. Now this was part of my family mythology, and I saw him, imagined him climbing a cliff in Yosemite, reaching upward, reaching for a handhold, grabbing a rock, the rock unfortunately dislodging, him slipping and falling 100 feet to his death at the bottom in the Merced River. And that's the way I saw the story. And then I had another uncle. Seems like I'm doing a bless on draw with the 7 uncles. I had another uncle who at the age of 12 was a brilliant chess player. A very brilliant chess player. He looked like a fullback for a major team, even at the age of 13 or 12. But he was literally the best chess player in Scranton. And Emanuel Lasker, Scranton has its distinctions. Emanuel Lasker was coming to town to play simultaneous chess against 20 people. Well, he would be blindfolded, and he'd play 20 different people at the same time. This was a standard performance get paid a fair amount of money for doing this. And because Sam was such a great kid player, they bought him a ticket to the thing, and he took one of the chess boards, and he was one of the 20 people playing Lasker. And the game developed in the usual manner in which Lasker killed the weaker players very rapidly, disposed of them, and he was coming down the home stretch, and there were still about 3 people left, in which the 12-year-old was it, and Sam had a winning game. My uncle had a one game. Of course, he would have to close it. In other words, he would have to close it. He might be intimidated by Lasker's fame into blundering when he should be literally squeezing Lasker into the mate. And he debated. Lasker offered him a draw, which was a lot of distinction. And Sam kept thinking, should I take the draw? He took the draw. And ever afterward, I always thought that what was wrong was he should never have taken the draw. So these were my 2 images of my uncles. The one who was trying to do something he maybe couldn't do, or the one who literally should never have taken a draw and took the draw? And I talked about this in a piece I did some time ago, in which I used the images of the two. So what is a poet supposed to be? Which one is it? The answer was never play for the draw. But then I was curious about the whole story, and I decided not to take the story of the draw, but I was fascinated with my uncle who died in Yosemite, and about whom nobody heard much anymore at all. The body wasn't shipped back, and the whole thing was sort of strange. There seemed to be a vacuum around the history of Lou. And I searched the net and found an obituary for Lou in the Berkeley Daily Gazette. The obituary published in 1934 on June 18th, in which it said that Saturday Lou Kisses of San Francisco, which I wasn't aware that he was, of San Francisco, fell to his death on the Nevada Fall, at the brink of the Nevada Fall, and his body was carried away by the Merced River, or else the spray of the great pressure of the downpour of water made it impossible for anybody to find the body. The park rangers searched the spray as well as they could, found nothing. And the CCC guys searched the surrounding area, and he came to the conclusion either he was held so deeply underwater that he couldn't be found, or the water had been washing down to the next fall. Now, the one thing though that seems is they explained that he had been standing barefoot in the river at the brink of the fall, and had slipped and been literally carried away by the current to his death. And the question struck me: how did they know he was barefoot? I mean, how did they know he was barefoot? And I figured, well, maybe what happened is the people who reported his loss reported the barefoot. Well, what would make them concentrate on the barefootedness? It's true that with bare feet you have more slippage possible, unless your feet are very rough, than a pair of good boots, climbing boots. A pair of good climbing boots would probably have given you more traction. But what was he doing barefooted? Why did he go barefoot into the river? To preserve the boots? Or was there some sort of funny act that he was performing? See, before this I had a heroic view of his fall in Yosemite. Now I was beginning to wonder whether he wasn't, as it were, playing a Greek sculpture or something, picking up one foot in the air as if he were going to do a ballet step. And then he was reduced to 1 foot on the ground, and the 1 foot slipped, and that was it. For a photograph? What was the point of all this? Maybe the shoes were still there. Did they bring the shoes back with them? Or somehow I have an image of two shoes standing on the precipice, at the edge of the precipice of the Nevada Fall, that had been left there by Lou before the photograph was to be taken. And now I know much less than I knew before, because there's nowhere there. Everything after that's a dead end. So I thought, well, let me see the other end of the other side of my storytelling technique, my image-making capacity, because I had turned my uncle into this radical failure. That is, this brilliant kid whose life was blighted forever after that by the fact that he accepted a draw. That was the way I looked at it, and I'm not sure that that's reasonable at all. A kid who gets a draw with Lasker, the world champion, and you get a draw with him, so any 12-year-old kid would look terrific accepting the draw. And nobody would have done it. And I kept saying, no, he should never have taken the draw. Well, I don't know what I would have done. Probably I wouldn't have taken the draw. But the point is, you don't know what the situation is like. So I wanted to find out what everybody, what did they say in Scranton about his kid taking the draw? They probably, I would imagine they might have celebrated it. I mean, have a world champion come in and have somebody take a draw with him, and the one who takes a draw with him is a 12-year-old. I should imagine they would have celebrated. I couldn't find any reference to it in the Scranton papers in the 1930s. Although that event was earlier, actually, I'm sorry, the death of Lou was 34. But the event with Lou must have been in the early 20s. When I went through all the newspapers around to find if I could find the story of Lasker coming to Scranton. And I couldn't find it. So now I'm faced with two stories that have wonderful formal narrative properties that I'm not sure have any truth in them at all. The heroic climbing of Yosemite may have been merely an act of vanity, to show somebody, look, we're here. Here I am in Yosemite looking cute. Now, it's not consonant with my view of him, because he was a very charming, handsome guy. It didn't seem to me that that would be his style. So what did he mean? Did he mean something? Was it a suicide? Was it a fatigue of life, a disgust of life that let him do it on purpose? That's also a demonic possibility, but I have no way of knowing. But the damn shoes keep troubling me. I keep thinking it sounds like, it literally sounds like the Greek philosopher who jumped into the volcano and left his shoes behind. Was that what it was? Was he putting an end to something? He had never been able to find himself. But he was only 24 years old, so not finding yourself at 24 is not a big deal. Not finding yourself till you're 30 or 35 is a big deal, but he didn't make it that far. So it comes in that contingency may have played, it may have been nothing other than a pure contingency. It's the same way that the death of my father 3 weeks earlier was a death based essentially on the unavailability of penicillin. Penicillin had not been invented yet, sulfa drugs were not available, and my father died of having his throat painted with silver nitrate, which in very mild and dilute form kills streptococci, but which in more concentrated form can kill you. The doctor was incompetent and it killed him. Wasn't his fault. So he was 27 years old. So what can I make of the imaginary death of my family? Nothing at all. That is to say, all I know in the uncertainty situation is more like what's going on. And so, in a way, now I've come to regard collage as a form of defense against the banality of narrative. And narrative is a defense against the dislocation, the exaggerated dislocation that the collage produces. And so I suspect that there are strategies, each of which is appropriate at some particular time for what you're doing. And what I'm trying to do is understand, or what I mean is come to tune to something. I'm trying to come to an idea of what's going on, and any means that are available is what I recommend. You use any means that's available, whether it's collage, or it's like narrative, or it's like pseudo-narrative, or pseudo-collage, and whatever works, works. How do you know it works? You know from experience. The same way Oliver Wendell Holmes said, judgment is not based on the law, it's based on experience. Unfortunately, the experience of the people we have in our present Supreme Court is such that I wouldn't feel too happy about it.